Okay, so I only have 3 points that I want to make, because one question is like, what is regulation? What is it we're even talking about if we're talking about regulation? And the first thing I wanted to say is there are a lot of different ways to define regulation. There's not a right answer to that question. I think one really helpful way for us to think about it together is regulations are the rules that establish what corporations can and cannot do. So that set the terms for business and marketplace behavior. They actually affect non-market participants too, all the time. But in the context in which we're talking about, that's the main thing. And the idea, although the term regulation can seem boring and wonky, and it has manifestations that are incredibly wonky if important. Once you say, well, we're talking about the rules of the road for corporate behavior, corporate accountability, corporate responsibility, corporate performance, you get that they matter a great deal, and they're not esoteric at all, and they are core issues for regular people. So that's the first point I want to make. Regulation just matter to people. The topic of this conversation matters to people in their everyday lives. Whether we're talking about rules that determine whether and how oil drilling companies operate and whether they're going to have disasters like the BP oil disaster in the Gulf or not. What the terms are for how banks in the financial sector operate and whether they're permitted to rip us off and endanger the financial system or not. Or in the current context, whether there are protections in place for workers from coronavirus or not. The price of drugs, whether they're going to be under control or out of reach for people, so that 1 in 6 people say they ration their drugs because they can't, and 1 in 6 Americans say they ration drugs because they can't afford them. That's the current case, or not. That's a regulatory policy question. So once you see that, you get this stuff totally matters. That's point one. Point two is corporate opponents of stronger regulations routinely put up a fake dichotomy between regulations to protect workers and consumers and the environment and health and safety and economic well-being. And the trade-off is by and large a fraud, as the coronavirus pandemic illustrates to us, right? So the idea that Trump wanted to open the economy because he was on the side of the economy and didn't want to do too much for health, that turned out to be completely upside down. You had to protect health in order to facilitate the economy. And that's generally true. But to the extent that there actually is a trade-off, what the federal government actually does, because it is so cautious and so overwhelmingly deferential to corporations, what the federal government actually does, even under Democratic administrations, is incredibly cost-effective. So using systems that are very biased in favor of corporations, the White House Office of Management and Budget calculates the costs and benefits. And when they do that, they find that the benefits of the regulations that are adopted under both Democratic and Republican administrations outdistance the costs by between 8 and 12 to 1. So you're getting a massive payback on the so-called expense of putting in place regulatory policy. And the third point I wanted to make is that Trump has promised in his 2016 electoral campaign that he would deregulate massively. And he has totally delivered on that promise to all of our detriment. So here's just one measure that really illustrates it very plainly. This is the drop-off in enforcement penalties against large corporations in the last 2 years of the Obama administration and the first year of the Trump administration. So it's pretty stark. They went down about 90% in terms of the penalties that were imposed. And here's the same data that you can see sort of organized by agency. But they have, whether it's enforcing the rules or taking rules off the books, the Trump administration has really gone out of its way to deliver on his promise to take care of big business. And they've done it in the most corrupt way possible, with leaders from regulated industry in charge of the agencies that they now regulate. That's true whether it's a coal lobbyist at the Environmental Protection Agency, or an oil and gas lobbyist running the Department of Interior, or a pharmaceutical company executive running the Department of Health and Human Services, and on down the line. That's the story throughout the administration, a really tight nexus between deregulation and blatant corruption and conflict of interest in a kind we've never seen before in any recent history. So those are my 3 framing points that I wanted to share with you. Let's get out of the sharing thing. And I'm going to step aside and then turn it over to our panelists. So you're going to hear in order first from David Dayen, the editor of the American Prospect and the author of the new book, Monopolized, really one of the great correspondents, but progressive or period, in America right now, and especially as regards coverage of coronavirus. Then we're going to hear from Celinda Lake of Lake Research Partners, in my mind, the best pollster in America, and certainly the fastest talking. So she's going to put a lot of information out in her 8 minutes. And then last, we're going to hear from Raj Nayak, who's now a fellow at the Harvard Law School, worked before that at our partner organization and greatly admired National Environmental Law Project. And then before that, worked in the Obama administration, a variety of positions at the Department of Labor. So he'll give us a regulator's point of view as we look backwards for how things were okay and now terrible and how they could be great going forward. So with that, I'm going to step aside and hand it over first to David. David, go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob, for inviting me to come on this panel. Great to be here with Celinda and Raj. So, I mean, the first thing I guess I want to say is the way I think about regulation, and I've talked about this in the various appearances I've been doing for my book, is that, I mean, the core is that there will be regulation. That whether we have a strong regulatory presence in terms of public regulation in place, or whether we have Donald Trump, there will be regulation in the sense that regulation is just rules by which we set markets, rules by which markets have to follow. So that regulation can be administered in one of two ways. It's either administered by a democratic process through public regulation that involves a give and take and a public comment period and allows the public to be involved in it, and at its best, it's taken in the public interest. Or we will have regulation devised in corporate boardrooms by corporations and corporate executives for their own interests. There's no real thing as deregulation. We do not create a Somalia in that regard. We then just leave regulation to the whims of the private markets, and then the public has no input whatsoever, rather than in a public regulatory process where we elect officials to then achieve this regulatory landscape. Sadly, what we've had over the last 40 years is regulation by the corporate boardroom. Most near to my heart right now, because of the book that I wrote, we have left antitrust policy on the table and allowed corporations to get bigger and more concentrated in a number of ways that affects wages, it affects quality, it affects the hidden risk that is taken into the system, it affects inequality, it affects politics. So it's sort of the key that I think unlocks a lot of all these other regulatory discussions. So I think once you see it in that frame, are we going to have public regulation or regulation by for corporations, then that I think is a better way to get across this idea that we need a strong regulatory state. Now, what can be done with that regulatory state? So last fall, it was actually the thing that got me interested in wanting to become the executive editor of the American Prospects, which I did last year. We wrote this series called the Day One Agenda. And the Day One Agenda was primarily a series of regulatory actions based on previously passed statutes by Congress. So this is a president taking action that he or she was fully authorized to take by Congress to execute the various laws that were taken up in those actions. So interestingly, we just followed on this just a couple of weeks ago, looking at the Biden-Sanders unity document and looking at all of the things that could be done on regulatory policy that could be undertaken without having to pass a new law, without needing Mitch McConnell's assent to anything, And we came up with 277 different actions that the next president can take without Congress. This is a full agenda that the next president can undertake. And it's right there, built into the statutes and built into the law. And I'll give you a few of those options. So one of the biggest ones we saw is the cancellation of student debt. So, I mean, what are we dealing with right now? The president, one of the four mostly useless executive actions that he took after talks between Democrats and Republicans collapsed on a new coronavirus response was this one that extended the student debt deferment. And what that is a regulation saying that under the Higher Education Act, the Education Secretary has the authority to simply not collect federal student loans for a period of time at his or her discretion. You can go further, and there's another part of the law, which is a regulation called Compromise and Settlement Authority, and say, we are going to settle this debt. We are going to cancel this debt. Or you can just do it by saying, we're just not going to collect this debt ever. You know, I mean, you just take the policy we're doing right now, which is not collecting until December, and say, we're not going to collect it until the year 2100. And so no one who is alive right now will have to pay any student debt. So that's one example of the power of regulation to bring tangible benefits to the American people. Another example, and it's something that is interesting with respect to the ticket, Democratic ticket, is a marijuana policy. So under the Controlled Substances Act, the Attorney General has the authority to take a regulation and say, we're going to deschedule marijuana from the list of controlled substances. This is a policy that the vice presidential nominee, Kamala Harris, is very much for, and has sponsored the MORE Act, which would do this by statute, even though you can do it by regulation. And Vice President Biden has not signed on to that yet. But it is an action that can be taken at the regulatory level to say, we are no longer going to bring this pain into largely communities of color. And we are no longer going to make marijuana a controlled substance such that businesses that have, in states that have legally passed either medical or regular marijuana statutes, can't get banking because it's a banned substance at the federal level, for example, can't get small business loans, things like that. So that is a regulatory policy. There are a host of policies on climate, on banking policy, on antitrust, as I mentioned before, that you can undertake by executive action right now, based on existing statutes, to make real change. And as Rob showed in his initial thing, you know, the benefits of this are immense. The ability to safeguard both the public and workers, to promote prosperity, to promote competition, to promote equality and equity among all of our citizens is really limitless when you're talking about regulatory policy. So how are we going to get to this point? I think the biggest thing, and I know that Public Citizen is interested in this, and most people on the progressive left are, is personnel. So who is in the room, not just writing those regulations, but taking the discretion to say, we're going to use this regulation in a particular way, is incredibly important. And we need to expand the thinking of diversity when we talk about the personnel, particularly in these various agencies. So we need more people of color, we need more women, we need more, we need diversity on all fronts. We also need diversity of experience, and we need people who have diverse backgrounds to be in those rooms to decide those regulatory policies. And that means not people from the corporations that are being regulated. That means not people from the corporate law firms that defend the corporations that are being regulated. It means a completely different conception of who is making these decisions, putting new people in these positions to get this regulatory policy in a place that is in the public interest. So I think I'll wrap it there, and I'm excited to hear about what our other panelists have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Well, one part of figuring out how we get there is figuring out how we talk about it and how we talk about it in ways that resonate with the public. So we have the best person to talk about that up next, Slinda Lake. You're still muted. You gotta hit the unmute.
There we go. Thank you so much.
So excited to talk, you forgot to hit the unmute button.
It's true. And I was 2 miles down the road, as you said. Listen, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be on the panel. I love Netroots. Thank you so much in Public Citizens leadership in just so many areas. And we have adored the work that we have gotten to do with you. David, I'm so excited to get your book. And Raj, it's so nice to meet you. So I'm thrilled at the listeners on this panel. The good news is from the polling data is that the public is way, way ahead of the elite debate here. Doesn't mean there aren't some problems on some specific issues, but in general, the public is way, way ahead of where the mass dialogue is. So first, if we look at just general attitudes, and we'll lift the slides. Thank you, and my colleague is helping me here with the slides. But if we look at the first slide here, you can see that Americans increasingly believe that there is too little or the right amount of regulation, and declining percentages. Oops, that's the wrong slide. There we go. The public declining in terms of thinking there's too much regulation. So if we look at the next slide, I'm sorry. There you can see the time series. You can see in relatively few years, we've gone from 50% of Americans thinking that there's too much regulation down to 39%, and we're up to 25% who say just in general, we have too little regulation. Now, we did several things. We said government regulation, and it turns out that the support for federal government regulation is on the rise. It used to be that people wanted state and local. Not so much now. People think, no, we need a uniform standard nationwide. What happens in one state, air blows from one state to another. COVID goes from one state to another. So we need uniform and national regulations, and the support for national regulations is up. It used to be, we also used to use all these euphemisms. We'd say things like rules and safeguards, and that language is all really strong. But now, even if you say regulation, people are very supportive. The second thing and this is probably the most important slide that I'm going to show you, which is the next slide. This is, and Robert, you referred to this, for a long time, they have run pretty heavily on us, economic growth versus regulations. And this is one area, but the data is very similar in all the areas. And around the 2008 recession, there was some concern about regulation getting in the way of economic growth. Now there's very little concern about that. And by 65% people say, no, we should protect the environment. Only 30% say we should protect economic growth. And in general, there is increasingly a sense that whether we're talking about health regulations, whether we're talking about environmental regulations, whatever it is, that regulations actually can increase economic growth. They don't cost economic growth. They protect the little guy. They develop new areas like clean, renewable energy, and that in general, regulation is not a job killer. And people are increasingly skeptical of those claims. What they do worry about actually is what regulations are going to cost. They are worried that it may increase the cost of a product, or enforcement will require a tax increase, but they're not buying the job killer argument at all. That is true as well, by the way, for Wall Street regulation. And Robert, in your slides, you also pointed out how strong people feel about Wall Street regulation. If we look at the next slide, if you go from the general to the specific, you see tremendous support for regulation. This is the percentage of people who say there's not enough regulation, and it's almost half the people in health insurance and large banks, plurality in insurance, oil and gas, and Wall Street, and a substantial third of the population, higher ed, internet, food, and wireless phones. Manufacturing and automotive, this is an area where people are less sure that we need more regulation. But in general, by the way, it's only about a fifth of the population that would be for less regulation. And that means that we have a substantial number of Republicans who are in favor of the current regulations or more regulation. They're not in favor of deregulation. Women are also a huge constituency here. Women very, very suspicious about removing regulations. If we look at the next slide, we see that people are just absolutely adamant about more oversight of the banks. And people do not think, well, we've done that, we've taken care of it, job done. And in fact, people are pretty stunned that regulations are revisited. Like, we tested reauthorization of the Clean Air Act and clean air regulations, and people were going like, why would you need to reauthorize it? Why would you revisit it? We have the Bill of Rights, we have the Clean Air Act. Once you pass them, you keep them in place. So people absolutely flummoxed by why we would have to reauthorize them. And people think that as industries evolve, you need to update the regulations. You need to make them tougher because there are new loopholes, new developments. Notice that we have 40% of Republicans in favor of regulating the banks. We have almost 60% of independents, and then we have 76% of Democrats in favor of regulating the banks. So whether in the financial sector, people wildly, wildly in favor. And I think that's going to take off even more in the post-COVID economy. Here we asked, do you want more regulation or less regulation? And these are whopping numbers, right? 69% say I want more financial regulation. Only 15% say I want less. And even among Republicans, 60% say I want more regulation. Only 21% say I want less. When you talk about Wall Street and the practices on Wall Street are a threat to the economy versus regulations hinder innovation, Republicans are divided. Democrats and independents overwhelmingly say no. Wall Street practices, bank practices, predatory lenders, mortgage practices are all a threat. We need more regulation there. It doesn't hinder innovation. And in fact, they think that regulations can often permit more innovation by leveling the playing field, by encouraging new sectors. One area that is just a personal passion for me, so I had to bring it in, is if we support regulation of any kind, as Robert does, and as Public Citizen has been a long-term advocate of, and Prospect has been a long-term advocate of, we must reduce the role of money in politics. And the voters totally get it. They see a strong connection between lobbying and campaign finance reform and getting the kind of regulatory environment that we want. If we're talking about guns, people want stricter regulations. If we're talking about, and the next slide, privacy, a brand new area that's really come onto the scene. People strongly, strongly in favor of privacy, strongly think that businesses are only focused on profits. So if you want to protect consumers, you've got to protect privacy. And people believing that it's an uphill battle to keep their information safe. Here again, we see, and I think after this campaign structure, people want to protect their data and they really want to regulate the platforms. And very often, by the way, as we talk about abuses, it's really important for us to attach the platforms to the abuses. Otherwise, people feel disempowered. They feel like there's nothing we can do about it. It's just individuals. No, it's platform policy, and we should regulate those policies. So in general, opposition is not our problem. Efficacy and confidence is our problem, and making people feel like they can actually do something in the regulatory arena is our bigger problem. So how do we have effective messaging? Start positive, not negative. Start with the solution, not the problem. As Anat Shanker-Osorio often says, and she's one of my favorite message gurus, says, Martin Luther King did not start his speech out with, I have a problem for you. But every progressive starts our speeches out that way. He said, I have a dream. He was aspirational and shared values. Remember, and this is why Robert's question was interesting in the chat room, you don't have a 30-second soundbite anymore. You have a 6 to 9 second soundbite to capture people's attention. It is very, very important that we don't just sound like phenomena happened. No, there are rules in place. The system is rigged, and we have the power to join together to rewrite those rules. And it is very important to position the villain, and it is very important to name check politicians and lobbyists who rig those rules. People also have in their story very strongly corporate profits and self-interest over shared goals. And that populism, which Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have been so strong in articulating in AOC, it's very, very strong with the public. And then finally, we want to say what the villain's behavior is. So it's not about the people, what people pay. That's the problem. It's what corporations charge. It's not about the cost of prescription drugs, because like who in the hell knows what the cost of the cure for cancer is. It's what the companies charge. It's the price assigned by the drug corporations. So always make this in terms of the problem and the actor in the problem. This didn't just happen like the weather. It just didn't emerge. No, somebody created this world, and we have the opportunity joining together to create a different world. So I'll turn it over to Raj, and I look forward to your questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Linda. How do you follow David Day and Linda Lake? It's a hard act. Again, my name is Raj Nayak. Relevant to this panel, I spent 7 years in the Department of Labor in the Obama administration. I spent 2 of those years as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy, so kind of overseeing regulations. And so I'm going to pick up today, I'm going to talk to you from the perspective of a former regulator, covering 2 broad points. First of all, some lessons learned for hopefully the Biden administration as they think about making use of regulations. David went into a lot of really important points here. And second, talking a little bit about how activists can play an important role in the rulemaking process. But I'm going to start by picking up a little bit on Rob's theme. So why do regulations matter? Regulations can make a tremendous difference in people's lives, but the devil is always in the details, right? So just this spring, Congress passed this Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which required employers to provide paid sick leave or expanded family medical leave to folks who were hit by COVID-19 or COVID-19 related closings. The Trump DOL temporarily issued a rule implementing the law, but it's hugely problematic. For example, the law has an exemption. It says, if you're a healthcare provider, you're exempt. The Trump DOL read that broadly to deny leave to anyone who works in healthcare, even if they don't provide medical care. So like that includes the hospital gift shop clerk. And those sorts of tiny regulations can make a huge difference in people's lives. On the other side of the coin, regulations could also ensure that people get the full protection of laws in the books. For example, during my time at the Obama Labor Department, we issued a rule in 2013 that extended the minimum wage and overtime protections to more than 2 million plus home care workers around the nation, folks who are left out of coverage under outdated rules from the 1970s. We updated the overtime rule for the first time in over a decade, extending overtime protections to millions of workers who made between $24,000 and $47,000 a year. We also finalized a rule protecting retirement savers from losing money because of their retirement advisors' conflicts of interest, which would have saved folks $17 billion a year in returns on their retirement accounts. Now I say would have saved, like with the overtime rule, because the Trump administration didn't aggressively defend those latter 2 rules when they were challenged. And that really, to me, leads to our first lesson learned. and some of you might be thinking about being in the next administration or you know, activism in the next administration. So we've been thinking a lot about this as well. Like, what lessons do we take from the Obama administration? I want to highlight, you know, the top three. One is just start early. You know, executive action is really an important part of the policymaking process. It's not about having a backup if you can't pass laws in Congress. It's important to use executive action to make the most of laws that we have on the books now. And, you know, David put it really well. He's like, there are a lot of things you could do with the rules you have today. Much of my own experience in regulations was during President Obama's second term. And I really do think we did a lot of work to do the most we could for workers during that time. You know, my boss, Tom Perez, was an effective leader at the DOL, and the White House had our back during that time. But it's really important that that all starts on day one. The deadline for rulemaking isn't just to finish by the end of the term, and I know Rob knows this better than anyone, but it's to finish, you know, before the Congressional Review Act can allow your rules to get pulled off the books. I think I had like 6 of mine pulled off the books by the Congressional Review Act. But you also need to finish in time to have the agency and your own agency defend these rules in litigation. In courts, they're going to be stacked by new Trump appointees. You might even need time to reissue a rule if the courts say, yeah, not quite that way. And so ideally, you have the time to actually implement the rule too, to make sure it's working well, to make sure people can actually feel the results. A second lesson is you need to pursue some rules that actually make a noticeable difference in people's lives. There are things that are incredibly important that you need to tackle. The climate crisis, right? There are rules that really need to be, you know, they may take all 4 years of administration, but they're really important, they're existential. But it's really important to take some actions early on that people are actually going to feel immediately too, even if they're maybe not the very most important things, but they're going to actually make a difference. So kind of making the same point that David did, like thinking about the next administration, you know, you could look at student loan relief. And if you can make a difference on day one, folks will feel that, they'll feel like, and you know, David's point, to be fair, the Trump administration's done a little of that. But, you know, again, things that people will feel and they'll think about when they're looking ahead to, do I want to be active in the next year? Do I want to keep engaged with politics? Do I just go to sleep now that Trump has lost, right? But a reason to make people want to go and to be active civically, especially in the middle of this. Oh, the other thing is you want to think, especially in the middle of this pandemic and these kind of resulting overlapping crises we have that are hitting Black and brown families and communities harder than ever. It really is important to make sure that the federal government's doing something. And the third lesson is I'm going to take over the building back better language here. You won't be shocked to hear this, but the Trump administration has fundamentally broken the rulemaking process. They've rushed rules out the door. They've skipped steps in key analysis. They've evaded career staff reviews. That's one part of the reason why they've lost some high-profile cases. You know, DACA is a great example. Not to mention a lot of rules out of the Department of Education, right? These are places where the Trump administration has just not checked the boxes they need to check. The Biden administration will need to do some rebuilding of the rulemaking process. But this, in my mind, is the perfect build back better moment with an emphasis on better. There's no need to rebuild the process exactly as it was before to replicate it to its what it was historically. We actually have the chance to rethink and to be pushing them to rethink what should the process look like. So my friend Todd Tucker and I wrote a paper for the Roosevelt Institute, Rethinking Rulemaking, and I'm thankful to David for giving us some space in the prospect as well. But the principles that we were setting out was rulemaking should be more proactive. When the White House is telling agencies to think about rules, it shouldn't just be show us what you're doing and we'll poke holes in it. It should also be, where should you be regulating? Should OSHA be thinking about an infectious disease standard? Where are there areas of underregulation we should be getting into? The second is centering equity. Cost-benefit analysis shouldn't be just thinking about overall impacts on small businesses, but should think about what are the impacts on communities who are too often marginalized by policy. That might be Black folks, that might be immigrants, that might be LGBTQ folks. That also helps us make the case for why rules are important. And the third point is creating space for engagement. Agencies should find a way to engage with people who are actually impacted by regulations, right? It's great to publish a proposed rule in the Federal Register. I read it every morning. I'm sure we all do. But at some point, like publishing the proposed rule and asking for comments isn't enough. We need real engagement with folks who are impacted. That can be via community organizations, that can be via membership organizations, labor unions, others. But making that kind of key effort and outreach will both get you better rules. It'll actually get you more buy-in in the system and folks understanding why it's important. So that's a good segue to my final point, which is how activists can make a difference in regulations and the rulemaking process overall. The number one lesson I learned of the DOL in rulemaking, to quote a former colleague, is that rulemaking isn't free. Yeah, it's easier than passing a law in Congress sometimes, But, you know, I mean, Linda, you made this point really well. Folks with money and power know how rulemaking works. They're going to come after the rules you're proposing. They're going to build astroturf campaigns. They're going to mobilize members of Congress and armies of lawyers to take you on. And activists who care about rulemaking absolutely need to be making the case for the rules and making even a friendly administration aware of their priorities. So my kind of top line advice for activists is, one, definitely consider rulemaking and other executive actions as part of your agenda. And again, push for them early. And I think we should all be kind of thinking about early. Two, try to build a coalition to align around a set of priorities and communicate those to the agencies you care about. Another colleague put it really well. If you don't know what kind of the priorities of the folks the stakeholders you care about are, you know, it's the folks inside an agency who make those decisions. And like, that's great, but it's really helpful to know kind of, you know, where people who are impacted by the rules land. The third thing is to push campaigns to push agencies toward what you think are the important reforms. Like, you actually need to build a campaign to both to push them to do the right thing, but also to give them space to do the right thing. And fourth and finally, in all the communications around rules, it's great to center people. Because I feel like too often, at least when we were talking about rules, I felt like the human impacts of wonky rules can tend to be lost in the data. And so for us, it was actually great when we had stakeholder meetings or comments or legal analysis, or even like you could see kind of op-eds out there or newspaper stories that centered people, because it helped us to kind of even tell the story internally about why these rules were so important. So anyway, really happy to engage more on any of this, and thanks for being letting me be part of the panel.
Thanks, Raj. Thanks to all three of you. What a great set of presentations. So for those of you who are in the attendee grouping, if you want to get engaged in the conversation, you need to hit the Q&A button and throw up a question, and we will get to it. And we have 10 plus minutes for this conversation, so don't delay. Raj, I mean, it's got to just be kind of a key theme for the whole Netroots conference, I assume, right? If Biden is elected, don't let up. If you want things to get better, rather than just sort of be less bad, push like crazy. I'm wondering, from your experience, I mean, it's totally true and interesting for folks who don't know, you know, you particularly and Secretary Perez pushed through a lot of important rules. That wasn't exactly true of the entire Obama administration. It wasn't even true of all parts of the Labor Department, and certainly not the whole 8 years of the Labor Department. What made things work when you guys were making it work, and what things got in the way when things weren't working so well?
Well, you know, this would be a great conversation. There are a million things we could talk about. One thing that I think is really important is there are a lot of things about rulemaking that I didn't know when I walked into the building. And I think one of the things that is really useful, there are a lot of conversations going on around now, just thinking about those lessons learned, right? You know, there's another rule we worked on, which was to protect kids involved in child labor and agriculture. And that's a great example of a rule, and you know that rule well, where, you know, we learned a lot about that rule. We learned a lot about, you know, the need to make sure that that there's a, you know, that we do our homework really well, that there's some thorough vetting of what's going on, there's a lot of stakeholder input, and that there's, you know, that we understand there's a campaign out there, and kind of understanding, you know, the pressure that you're going to be under. The good news about that is that rule actually taught us a lot about, you know, as we were kind of thinking about the fiduciary rule later, the conflict of interest rule, right, involving retirement advisors. You know, it helped us think about, you know, how we built a rule, how we did all the stakeholder engagement. I mean, the number of meetings on every side. When I say not on both sides, every side we did was helpful to try to find some common ground that would push people. And I know that rule got ultimately enjoined, and the Trump administration decided not to seek en banc review at the Fifth Circuit, which I think we would have had a good shot at winning. But I think that the ultimate rule was both kind of well done, and you saw like some of the big retirement investment firms saying, we can work with this, and we're gonna, you know, as you're saying, we're gonna be the ones who push this to innovate in the market. And so that rule taught us a lot about kind of the process you have to go through.
Yeah, for folks who don't know what you're referring to, that was a rule that said basically investment advisors can't have conflicts of interest against their clients, right? And you guys estimated it was a big saving, $17 billion.
$17 billion a year, yeah.
So it was not a small little thing. So Linda, I have a question for you about not talking to the public so much, since you say the public is with us, so we should talk to them right to sort of keep bringing them and strengthen them, but talking to politicians and kind of breaking through, because I do think there's this sort of stranglehold in certainly on Capitol Hill, and I felt it even more in the Obama administration. It was like they were living in the head of Ronald Reagan in 1982, right?
Yeah.
Red tape, like they were terrified of red tape, and that was like the controlling narrative, and you just fighting so hard. What can we do to sort of break through in the communications with them?
Yeah. So I think there are 3 points. I think first off, it's just to show that this is a way, regulation is actually a way to talk about some powerful other narratives that you want to talk about. So who's on the side of people? Who's watching out for the vulnerable? Who's going to be for level the playing field? Who's going to be for small businesses over corporate America? Who's going to take on the people that are rigging the system? Who's going to stand up for the little guy? There are just so many powerful narratives. Who's going to protect the health of our families? Who's going to be on the side of helping working families? There are just so many powerful narratives where regulation can be a way that you talk about it. And actually, it's a better way. And Raj made a very important point. You can pass a whole big program, but people are really nervous about how a whole big program gets staffed and the red tape involved in that and the staffing and the money. Where regulation, in a lot of cases, some of the things that we're talking about here, and I was struck by examples, Robert, that you gave and David and Raj, people think, why is this stuff even legal? If I had a nickel for everybody who's said in a focus group, I can't believe this stuff is even legal. I could fund Public Citizen for the rest of our lives. So, it's a very, very powerful way. It's a powerful way to establish that you're an outsider. And right now, it's a very good thing to be an outsider. There are some really interesting and powerful allies in this. One of the things we haven't mentioned is the partnership with the attorneys generals. And attorney generals are very, very popular in their state for the most part. They're the Justice Department now. They're incredibly aggressive, at least the Democratic ones are, and very popular with the voters for taking this action. So they're interesting partnerships with local public health officials, biologists. People think scientists are bribed, but not biologists. They think you'd never go into biology if you wanted to make big money. Like, who ever heard of a rich biologist? It just doesn't exist. So there are some really interesting ways in which you can show who you're aligned with, that you're an outsider, that you're listening to people. It's a great way to bring casework into legislation. And I'm sure Raj can speak of this, of people bringing constituency work to their legislation. And that is wildly popular with voters. So what people think is this is too complicated. They bring old frames to the table. They bring 1980s rhetoric where the voters weren't even born in 1980. And they don't realize how popular this kind of conversation can be on so many fronts.
We have a great question from Maggie Gomez here. I'm not sure if you all can see it or not, but I'll read it for folks who can't. Maggie says she's with the Center for Health Progress in Colorado. We've recently won some rule changes in healthcare policy with our state healthcare policy and financing department, which is great. However, lots of these changes happen behind closed doors, and here's the question. Do you have a suggestion on how advocates and organizers can engage in effective public accountability, messaging, actions otherwise, for non-elected state officials? Or any of the three of you want to take that, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I come at it from the frame of media, and that's certainly a great way to get attention on these critical kind of issues. I'm sure, Rob, you remember this famous article talking about the aftermath of Dodd-Frank and how the lobbyists called Dodd-Frank halftime because the second half was going into the regulatory agencies and lobbying like hell to make sure that everything that was in Dodd-Frank was contoured to their specifications. And just knowing about that and calling attention to it in the public process as well, and obviously public comments and if you can, organizing coalitions to get in front of the people who write the rules, but also just using the power of the megaphone to, make the regulators aware that there's more than just a paid lobbyist that is paying attention to this issue. because sometimes it's just that, you know, we hear from the one side of this argument as regulators, and we don't hear from the other side. And, you know, it's hard for us to, you know, have stand up to that kind of pressure and do something that's not in the interest of the people that are sitting in the room telling you what to do. So so that's my frame on it, but I'm sure Raj, who's actually been in the chair, would have a better thoughts.
Oh no, I think that's actually a fantastic way to frame it. I would just say this is almost a Michigan's interest, although I'm kind of on the advocacy side now. So, but I would definitely say that the way Maggie put it is really spot on, right? You really do have to build in public accountability campaigns, and I'll also say that, you know, again, like there are inside and outside strategies too, right? There are definitely folks who are going to be pushing closer and kind of holding fire, and then there are folks who are kind of marching down the street, and both of those can have a role. And I'll say this as someone who sometimes was on the other side of that kind of marching down the street. It may not be fun at the moment, but you know, if you're on the inside, you know, whether or not you support something, sometimes it's actually not a bad thing to be able to say, you know, whether it's folks marching down the street, whether it's the polling results that Slinda Lake is showing us, what, you know, whatever the case, like, you know, there's actually like a groundswell for this, there's support for it. And that's kind of small d democracy at its best, right?
You know, one other thing I would add to what Raj is saying, and I'm struck by one of the comments in the chat box about transparency. People love, love, love accountability, and they think you have to attach accountability to it. So actually, when we're testing new regulations, like in initiatives and stuff, a very common question now will be, well, what's the accountability mechanism? Are they going to report back to us? And actually, accountability tests better than transparency. And I love one of the guys from our focus groups from Michigan, actually, who said, listen, the way I see it is transparency oversight means you get to watch it go to hell. Accountability means you need to get to do something about it. So people love this frame, and joining as politicians, joining with advocacy groups to build in accountability is wildly popular with the voters right now.
Yeah, great. I mean, I would just add that, especially if you're thinking, you know, I don't know what the particular department you're dealing with, but people who get less attention are more susceptible to attention. So there are parts of the federal government, and it's vast sections of state and local governments that, you know, they're not used to anybody holding them accountable or even asking. And just the act of doing that itself is a really powerful, positive disciplining effect. You know, the parts of the government that are subjected to pressure all the time, they kind of get hardened to it a little bit, used to it. Oh yeah, we got 5 million comments on the, you know, on the internet rule. So if we only got 200,000 comments on the next thing, what's the big deal? But you have other parts of the federal government that weren't worried about net neutrality, and they get 50 people calling them, you know, 50 emails. They're like very scared because they're just not used to it. So you often get that, I think, in state government. Well, our time is really just about up. Why don't I offer you at least each 1 minute? That's about all I got. If you want to have any closing comments, and then we'll wind this down and appreciate all the attendees.
Well, I will start with
you can go first. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. That one of the comments that people made, and I thought was so good, was wonky. When they thought about regulation, it was wonky. And I was thinking this might be too wonky a topic for a panel like this. So I really, really appreciated everyone's presentation, because it is, just remember that it is way more popular with the public than politicians think and understand, or bureaucrats think and understand. And that the biggest problem is not getting people to support it, but people joining together to think they can do something about it.
Great. Who's going?
You're good. Go ahead, David.
I'll just say this, just to extend my prior frame. When Amazon has you on as a third-party seller, you're engaging in their private regulation, their rules of the road on how you can sell, how much you have to pay them to get to the top of the listing and whatnot. When you sign a contract as a consumer or as an employee that has a forced arbitration clause in it, you're engaging in private regulation. That your right to a trial, your right to the court is taken away from you, and you are subject to this private law, a private court system. There are all sorts of ways in our daily lives where our lives are being governed by corporations. And that regulatory process has been commandeered in a kind of neo-feudalism, as my colleague Robert Kuttner puts it. And we don't have to stand for that. We are citizens. We can engage in the democratic process to make sure that the yokes of private government and private regulation are set free. And we really need to do that. This is about more than just, just sort of what technical wonkiness is moving a dial one way or the other. This is about our lives. This is about how we're going to be enabled to live our lives. And so it's crucially important. So I really thank you for having this panel.
No, and I was gonna say, again, thanks to everyone for, this was a really fun panel. I'm a policy wonk and I'm a political junkie, and I still daydream about the day after the election when I'm gonna delete Twitter and just take a long nap, right? But I wanna say, like, and that's what makes me really think, like, we really need to like stay engaged. I feel like, again, this kind of point that we need to create the space and the pressure for the next administration to do all the good things we want them to do. And so I kind of understand more than anyone, like that folks are going to be, especially after this election, whenever it ends, tired, and just want to say, like, let's all get together and see what we can push.
Yeah, I just want to double down as a last word on that. I mean, I think, of course, there will be, assuming Biden wins and assuming Trump leaves office, neither of which we should take for granted, right? Two separate independent factors. Assuming those things happen, of course, we're going to breathe a sigh of relief. Some things will change. We won't have a president who's routinely racist and misogynist, for example. But, it's up for the Biden administration will be up for grabs in a lot of ways. A huge amount will depend on who's in, but not just who's in, like what's done to them. It's 100% certainty that there's going to be significant factions, and even part of Biden's head, at least for sure, that say, let's not do too much. Yeah, of course we have to restore things to the way they were because things went crazy with Trump. But let's not go too far, right? If we go too far, we're going to kind of unsettle things again. And our job as the Biden administration is to calm things down. Let's not do too much action because that would be executive overreach. Let's not tussle too much with the corporations because that's going to kind of create the kind of conflict we don't want. Let's not go to battle with Mitch McConnell too much, right? Some priorities, but not too much. And if we let that happen, then we're going to be in a really bad place. Among other things, we're setting it up for the Republicans to win the next contest. But besides that, we're just not going to achieve the things that the country desperately needs. And the pandemic, if nothing else, the pandemic gives us an opportunity to sort of break through all this kind of restricted mindset and do things that are big and bold, because it is 100% certainty that January 2021, the country is going to need really transformative things, not just because of the general damage that Trump did, but the insane damage that's going to be inflicted health-wise, economic-wise, socially through the pandemic. So it is absolutely the case. Our work will not just beginning, but enter a new phase, and we absolutely can't let down, including especially in the regulatory space. As attendees, thank you all for joining, and thanks to the three of you for being so great. Stay tuned in Netroots Nation. Thanks, guys.